everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Wednesdays. So if you are new, React Wednesdays is a weekly stream we do every 1 o'clock here in the US Eastern time, where we bring in people from the React world to chat about React. Lots of times we get into live coding. We have a little bit of fun. This week we have Obed on, which we'll talk about in a minute. And actually, 2 weeks from now, we will be joined by Eric Elliott as well to talk React unit testing. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But for today, let me introduce who we've got with us. We've got, as always, Dan Wilson.
Hey, I'm Dan Wilson. I work with Digital Primates, and we do enterprise React consulting. We also curate the enterprise React newsletter. So if that's your kind of thing, Google it, subscribe. We won't sell or spam.
As well as Christian Pillsbury.
Hey, also Digital Primates employee. I do the same sorts of things that Dan was just describing. I'm on the engineering consulting side of that fence.
Awesome. And our special guest today is Obed Parlopiano, right? I got it. Did I get it?
Yeah, you got it right.
That's
Okay.
amore.
Yeah, I was just eating pasta just before this. Yeah, so I'm a senior front-end engineer. I currently work on creating a website builder for WordPress, and I'm also a mentor at Thinkful, and I'm a writer at my blog obedparla.com, where you can find kind of the articles that we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, so the topic for today is React mental models, or basically ways of sort of thinking about React sort of conceptually, at least if I'm understanding this right. So you want to provide an overview of what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure, perfect. So let me just share the screen so I can show you a bit of some eye candy.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you say, like a mental model is basically a way that you can think about the world and understand it better. So for example, you think about a car and you don't think about all the little mechanical pieces it has. You just have a mental model of how a car behaves, and then you can just use it. So it's the same with all the technologies that we use. And I think React is really good for this because it's built on top of a lot of mental models. So like, for example, this is kind of the general mental model that I show at the end of both of my articles. And it just basically shows all the components being boxes and moving from one part, from one kind of state or one transition to another. And once you start thinking about components and React and frameworks and JavaScript in general, in this way, I think it really helps to kind of solve problems and find bugs. And it's just kind of a more effective way of thinking, right? And just looking at the syntax and trying to find what's wrong with it.
Yeah, it can simplify the understanding of something, but it also helps to have the right mental model. My kids have a mental model that cash comes out of the ATM and electricity comes out of the wall. And so they tend to think these things are infinite. They're not for us. So, if you have the wrong mental model, you can go down certainly some strange paths. Can you kind of walk us through how you decided to use this concept to frame React?
Yeah, so
we got a man down.
We lost Obed.
The evil hackers at the new JavaScript framework have taken down the feed. They just don't want this knowledge to be out there.
They don't want people learning React.
I left instead of like stop sharing. All right. Yeah, so answering your question, actually that this was an idea that I had for a while. Like I was just had this nagging feeling that I actually never read anything that explained the mental models behind practically anything. Like when you read an article, it's always so technical. Like they always try to explain, this technology works in this way and this way, always with like very technical lingo, instead of saying you can think about JavaScript in this way, or you can think about React in this way. And it's like that with pretty much everything. And I just thought like, hey, I never think about the tools I use in this way. I always think about them in kind of a mental way. I always have these visuals in my head and I have images. So I thought like that would be really great if I would explain that and people could actually see that. And actually, when I was writing this article, like I had it almost finished, like 1 week before I published it. Maggie Appleton, she did a really good talk about it, and she like basically showed some really cool mental models with like her incredible designs and everything. I was like, oh shit, this is like the first time I've seen it. It was really good.
Actually, curious, we have some fans of your visuals. I'm curious, you created these yourself, right? So this is, I guess, like, were those, is there some program you used to create those visuals, or how did you build those?
Yeah, so for doing those, I use Figma. So Figma is kind of a online tool for creating mostly websites and like web apps, but it's also very simple, and it allows you to just create this type of very web-oriented images, which is mostly kind of boxes, and it's kind of a web version of Photoshop without all the crazy images stuff, or kind of a Illustrator, I would say.
Yeah, that's good, because I can't even draw stick figures. So thankfully there are people like you that can put good stuff together.
That was actually quite time consuming. Like, I never used Figma before. I used it only from like a development point of view. Like, you know, a designer does their thing, and then I just check it, you know, how many pixels from here to there. So then I decided, okay, I'm just gonna do my kind of boxes with it, and I learned it, and it's actually very easy. It's super intuitive. Like, I've used Illustrator in the past, you know, 10 years ago, and it's so unintuitive. Like, you need to follow a 3-hour tutorial in order to like kind of draw a box in Illustrator. With Figma, it was super simple.
Yeah, I'm with you. I learned how to make a circle in Photoshop because I was looking for a circle tool. And it turns out back then, the way that you did it was you used the circle marquee tool and draw an outline of a circle. And then you feather it by a certain number of pixels. And then you select the inverse, and then you paint inside of that selected area with some color. And I thought, I don't think this is for me. Like, let me go write some code.
Yeah, exactly. Figma is just like, you know, there is literally a circle tool, and then just, you know, circle. Hey.
How far we've come in 20 years. You know, I'm curious, like you've got 2 articles out, and they cover a wide variety of React topics. What made you settle on these topics for your articles?
Yeah, so I wanted to cover, like, I have some friends that they wanted to learn development, and usually when you want to learn kind of front-end development, you end up usually in React. Like, it's kind of a settled, it's either Vue or React at this point. So I wanted to always direct them somewhere that I felt was good enough for them to kind of have a grasp of the general idea of how the framework behaves. But I didn't really have anything at hand. Like, I haven't read anything that wasn't so technical that they would be like over their heads, but it was in depth enough to give them a good idea of what it was. And like I said before as well, I hadn't seen an article that was kind of visual. So then I decided, okay, what are the most common things, or what are the things that people need to know about React that they use every day? And then that's kind of the thinking path I follow. Like, okay, the most basic stuff is what React actually is. You know, a component is what you're using all the time. So that was the first article, mostly kind of a component, how it behaves. And then the second article is one level above. What are the things that you need in order to make a component powerful? So, okay, state and use effect and those things. Okay, that's what it kind of gives more power. And then the third one, which is already it, is, you know, one step above that. Like, what do you need in order to kind of maybe not have a complete understanding of React, but enough to defend yourself and know the most things that you're gonna use on a day-to-day.
Would you mind bringing your screen back up and maybe walking us through one of these? We have a little bit more of a like a picture of one of these.
Sure thing. I'm not sure if it's better to show an article or one of the presentation. Let me just check quickly.
Yeah, either or. Yeah, I'd also be curious to your advice to people, like if this is more of a teaching tool, or like should you try to like build some of these things based off your own thinking of it kind of in your own sort of unique way, right? Like, I think everybody thinks through how some of these concepts work a little bit differently?
Yeah, like I think it's a bit of both. Like I've had a lot of people saying they finally understand React thanks to kind of these articles, because like I was saying, you always think of things in technical terms. The syntax, people focus a lot on the syntax, how to get X done, and you need to follow A, B, C, D. So unless you have a lot of experience, especially for beginners, it's not only React, but they're usually also learning JavaScript. So unless you have a very solid understanding of JavaScript, and then you can see, okay, this is JavaScript and kind of this is React. When you're learning, it's just all kind of a mesh, and you don't know where one thing starts and when another thing begins. So yeah, this was kind of a way to help people solidify their understanding.
So we do some pretty beefy training that we've developed in-house for all of our employees, and we rely heavily on mental models. This is very much in our wheelhouse, both in terms of like the more functional way you're approaching a lot of this stuff, but also just the reliance on mental models or analogies or reference. So it definitely rely heavily on it as a teaching tool.
Yeah.
And one of the other interesting things that's comes out of that I'd be interested to hear your take on is you talk about as like a framework for problem solving stuff, but we've actually gotten a lot of value, not just from that, but also as a way of creating a common vocabulary for describing. So it's more interpersonal and not just individual. It's not just like what's modeled in your head, but how do you communicate what's in your head to someone in someone else's head, right?
Yeah, actually I think that's a very good point, and something I gave some thought when I was writing the articles. I just wanted to not use any fancy words. Like, okay, like a component it's just a box. It's like literally it's kind of as a box that does something, and has boxes around it and props and state and I don't know, side effects, and like I'm still not sure what a side effect is. I've been working like it's kind of all these fancy words that you need a whole Wikipedia article for you to fully understand them. So in this way, like for example, in the image that I'm showing it's just kind of a box. And for example, closures is one of the most hated topics of JavaScript, or the most misunderstood. And I think it's very simple. It's just that's unrelated to React, but you cannot really understand React until you understand closures. So a closure is just kind of a box that it's semi-permeable. So you can get stuff from outside, but nothing can go from it to outside. So that's it. It's like your skin can absorb stuff, but nothing can go outside. That's basically what a closure is in like the vast majority of languages. So once you think about it that way, it's like, oh wow, okay. If I have a function, my function is the box. Inside has some stuff, and I can receive from outside, but it cannot take anything outside. And that's kind of pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, you can see like a beginning JavaScript or even a React developer would go through a series of tutorials and have an idea that, this line of syntax accomplishes this goal, but they might not be able to articulate what a closure actually is and why it's relevant. And that'll end up biting them n number of times later until it finally dawns on them what the whole thing actually is. Sometimes I feel like, we should start with mental models and then go into the tactics. Otherwise, it's almost like working from the inside out. Like you build this thing that you have no idea what it does until you build enough of them and make enough mistakes that you finally understand the strategy at play. And that's how you can really kind of tell if someone is a qualified senior developer is, do they understand in a broad sense what they're doing? And I think, learning from blogs and articles, it takes a while to get there because you don't just stumble into what is a closure. You see it being used in an article, you say, okay, it's a fat arrow next, let's move on. And somewhere down the line, something doesn't work right. And then another piece of understanding comes in and you start to understand a little bit more about this thing. But if you start with the process you're using, then you kind of have the high level idea of what you're doing. And then you can kind of fill in later. And I think it would make more sense to start this way.
Yeah. I have some students on, it's called Thinkful. It's kind of a boot camp in the US. And that's kind of one approach I've seen that works quite well. Like I usually don't go into code with my students so much unless they need help on the code itself. But we always just discuss. Okay, like you're gonna go into JavaScript, right? Yeah. So like what does JavaScript do? So like oh, it's a Turing complete language. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's basically what is JavaScript? It's just a language that lets you do anything on a computer or in a browser. Let's say you can literally do anything you can imagine on the browser. That's it. And then how do you do it? Well, you need to learn the syntax and some specific ways to tell the computer what to do. But that's pretty much what JavaScript is. You tell the browser to do something and it will do it for you. And then HTML is what the person sees. CSS is how pretty they see it. So it's kind of makes it easier, like you say, to first learn the very broad models, the very broad understanding of how something kind of behaves, and then actually know how to make it do something that you want.
Have you found, I like the teaching perspective. One thing I found is there's different styles of learning, that some people are more like bottom up learners and some people are more top down learners. Have you found that like there's that difference of this works really well for some people and then it makes it like harder for them to like translate something that's in some sense this is a little bit more abstract, and they actually work better with like the concrete, I want this to do this very specific thing, how do I do it? And then they kind of get the more abstract concepts as a result of just doing it more and more. I don't know, that's been my experiences.
Yeah.
Different learning.
I never seen that actually. Like I never seen it someone that dislikes a higher perspective. Like it's like everyone says that some people are visual learners and some people are whatever else. I never seen that. Like every single person I ever seen is a visual learner. Maybe less so than others, right? Some people actually prefer reading rather than watching a video. Mm-hmm. But if you show them an image, for example, they will understand it. This is kind of human nature. Like if you see a picture, you will understand the picture.
Yeah, I think those, your aptitude for learning in a video sense is a spectrum. It's not necessarily binary. But, going back to Christian's point, I think there are people who want to dive in and get their hands dirty. But almost everybody I can think of would rather know directionally where they're trying to go. And instead of being told, move left 2 degrees, move left 2 more degrees, like at some point you're like, well, what's the point? And the point is you want to know the higher level piece here. And so, definitely these concepts apply. I wouldn't think we should just apply them to everybody and make them learn in this way. But the higher level piece is key.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can depend on learning level too, because like if I'm if I've been doing React for a long time and you're trying to teach me like some like React framework, I'm not going to want you to start with some big mental model of how this framework fits into like the React ecosystem, because in my back of my head, it's like, yeah, I got it. Just show me like the code and what this does. But even like, I think a JavaScript developer that's very experienced, if they're coming to React for the first time, there are a lot of new concepts to understand. Yeah. And if you just showed someone who knows JavaScript in and out, but you just showed them one like react.useState line, that's enough to make you go like, well, what in the world is going on here, right? So I think like some of this just depends on where people are coming from. And it's always hard in a teaching environment to cater to everybody based off many different perspectives. But I think I tend to agree that anybody can use the visual stuff for things that they're very unfamiliar with. Because if you're mostly familiar with it, the graphics are less helpful. Whereas if you're really coming to this and you need to understand something that's well out of your comfort zone or something completely new, the graphics can help quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. Like you reminded me of, I don't know if you guys saw the presentation for Recoil, VR Recoil, the framework state management. He used a lot of visuals, and like those are quite literally mental models. Like he was saying, this thing is orthogonal to the state. So like I need to Google what orthogonal means, right? But once you show like 2 images, okay, this is the React state and this is the relay state, and basically it's just a 1-to-1 transition, but they connect so that they're not on top. They're not connected. They're just kind of orthogonal, and that way you Yeah, exactly. The way you kind of grasp the way the library works or how it aims to work without actually knowing the ins and out of it. Like, okay, you understand this thing wants to mimic the React state while kind of keeping it safe on its own bubble.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't
your
even.
last slide sort of had an idea that you were showing immutability of state, and you can say that. I think it was one about this doesn't change, and this one, state remains constant, everything here changes. Like, we could certainly have a contest to see who could use the most computer ease to describe what's going on here, but my kids could understand, hey, state remains constant, and all the components and component trees, there's where all the changes happen. You're not going to get any more understanding of that using larger words. It's just what it is. And larger words can be, here it comes, orthogonal to proper learning. Do I get points for the callback? We had an interesting comment here from Blue Milk Run.
Yeah, it depends on how well formed your mental model already is.
And this to me means there's a certain readiness to apply newer concepts. And if you come to this with a higher state of readiness, maybe this kind of simplified way of showing it could maybe be detrimental. I'm not sure, but what do you guys think? Yeah,
I actually brought up the recoil video that Obed was referring to. I dropped it in the chat if you haven't seen it before, but I didn't. It's funny that you mentioned it because I had watched it before and I didn't even think about the fact that he relied so heavily on mental models to explain the concept. And to the comment from Blue Milk Run that came in too, he was speaking very much to people that were familiar with React, right? He had some assumption that you knew the basics of React and his mental models like built on top of that. Like, okay, you already know how state management works like by default in React. I'm going to use these pictures to like differentiate between what you're used to and here's what we're going to be doing instead. And it was really well executed.
And the general concept of a mental model, like as far as we understand it, it's you're always coming to the table with background understandings that are simplifying the universe of what you're trying to make sense of.
Yeah.
And so like these are all just variations on that kind of theme where like, whether it's visual or other conceptual bits and pieces that are fitting together, you have some kind of way of like carving up the space to make sense of new things based on your old things, right? That's kind of the high level of what's going on there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think what the previous understanding that you have is very important. Like I wasn't sure who to aim, like the audience for those type of articles, because they can get quite technical. But then at the same time, what's the point of going to like a super experienced audience and being like, here's my mental model of this thing that you already know exactly how to use? They will probably already have their own mental models, even if like people are not aware that those are mental models. I think that kind of that's just how the human brain works. You will make some simplified version of the world because otherwise it's just too complex. So I think that the less experience you have, then the more you gain by having someone with a lot of experience kind of take that piece that they needed one or 2 years to build, because like needed like 2 years of using React a lot to like have these very clear models, and then just kind of giving it to you and hey, this is how I think about this tool that I use. That's basically what I wanted to do.
And let's also be fair and say that in a vibrant ecosystem, there's a lot more beginners coming to the table than there are experienced folks.
Yeah, definitely.
And you're also pointing out like something that plenty of engineers aren't necessarily competent at, which you've done very successfully, which is communicating your mental models. Like they might have their mental models.
Yeah, I've had that conversation before.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good point.
It was quite difficult, actually.
Yeah, you got there. That's good.
You boiled some stuff down into its simplest form here, and that in and of itself is hard.
Yeah, it was actually kind of a fun journey. Like I think for the first article, it was kind of straightforward because the mental models were not so complex. But then once I started doing, especially the one for use effect, I found out that I actually didn't understand a part, like a transition it did, and I was thinking it did something else. It's like, oh wait, I've been using this thing wrong, like since it came out, basically.
Teaching is learning twice.
Teaching is learning.
Exactly. I just read the docs like 5 times, and I was like, oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, I never needed to know exactly how it did it because my kind of slightly wrong mental model was good enough. Like unless you need to go super specific on something, you can have kind of incomplete models, and that still works. Like you don't need to be a mechanic in order to drive a car. You only need to have that knowledge once your car breaks down or stops working. It's like, oh shit.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about, where we try and use more than one mental model for some of the stuff we end up training for, and that's because mental models, like anything that's in the general family of analogy, metaphor, that kind of stuff, whether it's visual or linguistic, they're going to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things. Hopefully none of them are like lying in terms of how something works, but sometimes it's nice to be able to switch between different mental models to be able to like emphasize different aspects of how this stuff works. So like
definitely, yeah.
Well, and I'll say too that sometimes with some of these diagrams, there's a bit of a hit or miss aspect of them as well. Like I've been through presentations that people have been trying to explain something very conceptually, and it just like for whatever reason, it's not clicking. And then there's also been times where someone's doing this and like I'm like fully engrossed, like it's explaining the world to me. So I think just something about that, because it's relating to previous knowledge. And if you're not like putting it in terms that their priors exist on this person, it might not be hitting. And if you take multiple different approaches, just greater the bump up the odds that it's going to click with someone.
Yeah.
And actually, Obed, would you mind? You should explain this one, because this was actually my favorite from your article. I thought it was a really good model for dealing with this.
This was actually I did like 3 versions of this one because I couldn't quite, like, I'm not a designer. Like I'm not very good at putting what's in my head into paper. Like there are some people that are great at it. So yeah, this is basically when you are. Let me just go back one. Yeah, this is when you are on mounting a component, and this is kind of the more shady parts of a component. Like a lot of people make mistakes in this because usually when you have a component, you can see it. So you press a button, the counter goes up, you can see what it does. But then once it all mounts, it's like, okay, it's no longer there. I don't care what it's doing. But it's quite important to actually understand that it's still existing. It's gonna run some code. Like it says that like gears are in motion during mount outside of the component, and then once you unmount it, those gears are still turning. Like if you have a event listener, for example, or a subscription, like basically anything that lives outside of your box is still gonna be alive, even if the box doesn't exist anymore. So you need to make sure that you, I don't know, destroy those gears, pause them, whatever you have to do.
Yeah, especially for async stuff, we've gotten a lot of
Yeah, that's like a perfect way to have memory leaks, even security issues, because maybe you transition from like a logged in page to a logged out page, and you end up with like admin privileges because you didn't unmount something. So yeah, like those things can be quite important depending on the app that you're building.
It's also the thing a linter really can't catch either. So it's like if you forget to do it, nothing's going to tell you. You just kind of have to figure it out on your own.
Yeah, exactly. And like I think that's one of the things that the React team was criticized a bit when they came out with the API, because it's kind of unusual to have a callback that is returned that is only run at the very end. That's kind of one of the things that were criticized a bit. Like now people are just used to it. So it's not exactly intuitive.
Oh, the use effect method is bonkers if you think about it, really. Like trying to explain that to anybody is like between like the way the array works,
So
like
much going on.
it's just nonsense, right? Like no, it's like not descriptive at all. Like, oh, yes, you pass this call a second parameter that is an empty array if you want it to run just once. Like, okay, right? Like it's I mean, once you do, I mean, to their credit, once you do it, it makes some sense and you get used to it pretty quickly, but like it is not a descriptive API at all.
Yeah, not at all.
It helps breaking it down into like what these things are communicating. Once you have a sense of like the reason providing it, no arguments versus an empty array versus an array populated. So it's like, okay, that second argument is communicating, I have dependencies and these are what they are for rerunning. Then you say like, I have dependencies and it's nothing versus I have no dependencies, so it's only going to run once. Yeah.
Yes, so you've got a mental model handy for
it. Check him out.
That was the shortest part that I could describe the second argument with. It's like, why do I need 3 bullet points and like small paragraph to explain like one argument? And I mean, yeah, once you use it, you kind of, okay, yeah, it makes sense. The API is nice, blah, 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 but explain it to someone is difficult, definitely.
I wonder too, like React seems like a really good candidate for this sort of thing too, because React code is very, you can get a lot done very quickly, but it's also like full of little like tricks and things like how components work, what JSX is actually doing, state, use effect. There's so many. And I think we've talking to you about other concepts you could extend this to, because there's even more in React that is quite powerful. You can do a lot, and you can even do a lot without totally understanding what you're actually doing. But like having that actual understanding of what's going on can be powerful and almost a necessity as you get on to like more advanced development problems and tasks.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, I'm wondering if it would make sense to kind of walk through the models as you have them, just kind of quickly so we can show them. And then what I'd like to know after that is, based on the articles that you've written and the feedback you've gotten, where have you seen either the most interest or the most confusion?
Good question. The most confusion. I don't think I've gotten a lot of feedback saying like, hey, this part wasn't clear. I think most people are like, I don't know, I feel very lucky with this type of articles. I haven't written anything so popular before. And usually people are like, they get bombarded with complaints about, oh, you're stupid for saying it this way and not this way. I think I was lucky. I didn't get anyone being mean.
Nice. The internet's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. For me, even like the article, the second one made it to like Hacker News for first spot for like quite a few hours, and I was expecting like a lot of people being mean because that's what the website is famous for. But yeah, no one was mean. So
you posted on Twitter too? No angry people.
Yeah, I didn't get anyone being mean, and like I don't recall anyone saying like, hey, this part wasn't clear. Like I got some people saying like, hey, I'm learning React, and like this was useful. Like they didn't say, hey, I know how it works. I understand that I can code on it, but it was useful. Like that's kind of the things that like a lot of people said. And I think that was my aim, not to teach how to use React, just like, hey, kind of take this on your journey. Hopefully it will make it easier.
Yeah, I can say when I first read the article, like, you know, in the newsletter is where I first read about it, because our developer team submits all the articles. And I can't remember who submitted it at that point, but someone submitted it. And I thought, mental models, huh? By a guy with a really long last name. What's this going to be about? And I read it. I'm like, okay, there's got to be another one of these coming soon. And then a couple of weeks later, it popped up. I'm like, yeah. So I put that in there too. And I read it. And I actually understood React quite a bit better as a result of that. You know, I'm the quote marketing guy, so I don't have to write production code anymore. And I'm also been learning React this year. So as part of that, you know, I've kind of gone the inside out route, follow a tutorial, build a tic-tac-toe app. And I could like say what I learned, but being able to apply it in a holistic way really took either making a bunch of mistakes or kind of catching a higher level explanation like your mental models. And so, for me, it was helpful. And I can say this, on the internet, critical comments breed critical comments, but compliments are few and far between. So if you got one compliment, at least 200 other people also liked it.
Yeah, I was very happy about it actually. Like people were super nice and yay.
That's right. What about your work with this boot camp? How did that influence these ideas to put this together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't remember when I started thinking about kind of this mental model sort of thing. Like I started with the bootcamp like 2 years ago. So kind of I started teaching people code. But I think one of the transition points was December last year. I went to React Berlin, and like it kind of clicked on me that hey, no one is talking in a more visual, holistic, more human way. Like everyone either is telling kind of a story, which is great. Like there were some talks that were very story oriented and then kind of explaining code through a story, which is great, or very technically. Like there were nothing in between that was kind of a more visual, mental images sort of thing. So I really like that. And then with my students, I just started kind of realizing that that's the way I like to teach them. Like, hey, this is the way I think about code, rather than this is how code behaves or this is what you have to do. It's like this is how I specifically think about these things, and I think they found it helpful. So that kind of started the path of making me kind of write these articles eventually.
Mm-hmm. So in the first article, you talk a bit about components. You talk a bit about JSX properties. Kind of walk us through this part.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a bit of an explanation of what a mental model is, and in short, it's just a simplified version of the world, and we have that for kind of everything. And I think the phrase mental models is not very popular. Like it's not in the mainstream, I would say. But yeah, you basically have one for every complex object or system in the world. And yeah, I just explained a bit of JavaScript because I realized that you cannot really explain the mental models of React if you don't have at least a basic understanding of the mental models of JavaScript for like the basic building blocks. So yeah, it's kind of a function. It's kind of a box. I say it somewhere around here. And then I say that, hey, a component is quite literally a function that is nicely wrapped around JSX, which at the end just becomes literally a function.
Yeah, so and if you stick right there, when I first came to React, my mental model for what JSX was basically, oh, this has got to be HTML. And it turned out it was HTML, except there was a bunch of little traps to fall in, like, oh, you want to use class. Well, it's not really class, it's class name. So just go ahead and add that to the list of weird things. And it used to just really annoy me for some time until I can't remember who pointed it out. It's not HTML, it's basically JavaScript. And I'm like, oh, well, that's why my mental model isn't working correctly because I'm using the wrong one.
Yeah, I think this was the part that, like, the most favorite part of both articles. Like people, whenever they were sharing it, they usually said like, components are just functions. That was kind of the highlight of the articles. Like people realize like, wait, yeah, like components are just functions. And that kind of, if you already know JavaScript and you feel comfortable with functions, then you should feel comfortable with components. And that's something that like, it made a lot of people click like, oh, hey, I can actually, do this React component thing because I already know how a function works. And it's the same, like, props are just arguments, and state is just kind of special something that in the function that doesn't change. It's not that different. It's just that you see it, the syntax is different. You see it in a different way.
Yeah, one thing I've experienced, even with some more senior developers who just aren't as familiar with either JavaScript or more pointedly with React, even with pure functional components, they forget that it's a function that's getting invoked. So when I start talking about like you're recreating this thing every time because anytime you're rendering, you're literally invoking a function. So it's also good as a reminder for as people are like struggling with a problem. It's like, okay, take a step back. Remember, this is in the end, this is just a function. If you invoke a JavaScript function, what happens? And so I've gotten a lot of legwork on helping people like when they're struggling with problems, just reminding them of these facts.
Yeah, I think also your model of just having a component being a box too is quite nice, because that's sort of the next thing in the progression that comes up is like, okay, a function or a component is just a function.
Yeah,
but then how do they?
Great.
Yeah, how do they
I didn't do
play
it.
nice together? So
you didn't do that one?
Totally vandalized.
Man, it's like one of my childhood heroes has been arrested for something terrible. There's no faith in the world anymore.
I didn't even write the text. It was already there. I just found it. I was like, oh, this is perfect.
Yeah, it's a perfect image.
Yeah, that's funny. But yeah, actually, what Christian said is kind of true. Like I think that's the most useful mental model. It's just a function, and once you think about it that way, it allows you to do a lot of things. Like you can copy a component into another constant, like a constant, for example, and then use that constant if you want. Like that's perfectly valid, because at the end of the day, what React is gonna do is just call a function, execute it, and whatever it pops out, that's what it's gonna do.
Yeah,
but then you kind of get constrained.
You can also export it. You can pass it to other functions, right? Like it's when you think of components as components, it's harder to think of them as that way, because like your brain almost treats them as like, oh, this must be some special JavaScript thing, when really it isn't. It's something you're already familiar with. Yeah, and if they understand and are familiar with like the ideas of like higher order functions and the fact that you can pass functions in as arguments, then you can start getting into some fancy stuff of like, I have a property which is a renderer, and I can pass that down, and then I can write JSX that just says, use this renderer, which is just a function, with these props inside this next component. And then so the more you can like build off of that, it's really helpful for getting people to start thinking about different things. Hello.
You're saying hello. Yeah, I think functions is so useful, and like it's JavaScript, so really everything it's a function. So yeah, I think that's the most powerful of all the mental models. Just it's a component, it's a function. You can treat it as such with kind of some special rules. You need to start with a capital letter, that sort of thing, and yeah, it just opens up a lot of doors. Like I remember when I started learning React, that's one of the things that struck me the most, was that separating what was JSX and React from JavaScript. And I actually had a lot of people saying that, like friends and students and everything, kind of being confused where one starts and the other finish. And some people even saying like, React is JavaScript, or React is a different programming language that is not JavaScript. And that's just gonna confuse people, because then they have like two realms that they need to put together, when in reality it's just one thing. Like I always tell my students, like, if you can do something in React, you can do it without React. You can do it on vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah, there's already enough stuff people have to learn to be a functional React programmer. Adding contrived things makes it even worse.
So we've got about like 10, 15 minutes left here. So I just encourage anybody in chat, if you have any questions or things you'd like to discuss or bring up, to go ahead and get that in. And Obed, I know as you go through this, one thing, at least the last question I had that I was curious about, is what other models you have in mind, like any other concepts. I definitely have like a wish list of things I'd like to see. So I can pressure. If you want, I can spend
camera.
So you've got a fan in the chat here as well.
Wow.
But I could just spend the next 10 minutes just talking about every React concept I still don't understand as well as I would like. And maybe you could just help me with each and every one of them. I know like context always, like I still to this day don't really understand what like context and provider does in React. So that's one on my list. I'm curious if you have any others that like concepts you want to spend some time sort of writing up.
Yeah, actually, I'm writing the third parties about context because that's kind of
there we go.
the next step once you go up is like, okay, context defines some of the rules that the components have, you know, like, okay, data just passes down one by one, and then context kind of goes around that. So it's useful to understand. I had like I would love to write about kind of Redux and just the state management in general. Like that, I think that's the most confusing one, even though it's kind of super simple.
It's like the final boss level for mental models is if you can make one that's understandable for Redux.
But it's actually surprisingly simple. Like I struggled with Redux quite a bit when I started. Like when I started learning React, I don't know, 3 years ago or something. I just learned React because I was kind of super afraid of Redux. And then once I used it, I realized like it's just kind of simple. It's just kind of, I don't know. I have a thing for boxes. Everything in my mind is kind of a box. This is kind of a big box, which is Redux, and then all your app is just inside of that box, and you never kind of interact with Redux itself. It just kind of sends information directly to where it needs it, and if it sends information, you just ask the component like, hey, you need to refresh with this new info. That's basically everything Redux does. You know, you have a component, a box, and you just tell the bigger box, hey, I want to get updates for this thing. And then the bigger box, if one of those values changes, it just tells you like, hey, change, this is the new value, refresh. That's basically what every state management solution does.
Why would you say that? And I'm curious what the thinking is. Why would you say Redux kind of appeared complicated? Like what factors led it to appear complicating, but actually turned out simple? Like why did you have that experience?
Man. Like, have you seen? Now it's different. Now I think Redux is just better, like simpler to write. But when every single app was React and Redux, it was like you needed a gigantic boilerplate code to just be able to update a state. And that was just so intimidating. Like you have to send something, dispatch something that goes into a reducer with a value that then is gonna trigger an action, and then the action is actually gonna change it, but it needs to be what's the word? Like clean, you know, like it doesn't have any side effects. It just that's super intimidating for someone that doesn't even know how to use React.
Well, yeah, that's true. It's a lot going on. And I just saw a tweet today from Ben Lesh that said he rewrote rewrote RxJS into 55 kilobytes. And so hopefully it's easier to understand now.
Oh, that's RxJS, not Redux.
Am I reading this wrong? All right.
Well, they're two separate confusing tools. So it's
which in and of itself apparently is confusing.
Well, but in-house we use a lot of Redux observable middleware, Dan. That might be why you're getting confused.
I think that the key is what, even in Obed's explanation, like those words, like you have to use a reducer and actions. And those aren't words that immediately go like, oh yeah, reducer, duh, right? Like that, I don't have that effect. Like I need something to put that in terms of something I'm already familiar with or already know how to do.
Actually, like all like your question to Jay was like, what else would I like to write about? I think like everything that has some fancy word has a mental model. Like reducers was something that I was also quite intimidated for a while until I kind of understood it. And it's like, again, it's super simple. You give it something, it gives you something back in return. It's simple, but the word reducer is not very, like I have never used that in normal English.
Yeah, you don't
reduce.
It's not a common conversation. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna reduce this pineapple into like what? And like, yeah, I think, yeah, like reducers, which is kind of Redux sort of thing. even Jest. I would love to write one about testing in general.
Yeah, like mocking and yeah,
mocking, like all of it. I never had to do heavy testing on any app until kind of recently, like 1 year ago from now. I had to do like very heavy tested apps, and I struggle a lot to understand all the nitty gritty of testing. And I was like, why is this so hard? It's just like a completely different realm, separated from like normal browser development. So yeah, I would love to kind of, because there are a lot of differences and they're not kind of clearly explained anywhere.
We got another from Blue Milk Run in the chat, another recommendation for Dan Abramoff's Just JS email series for good mental models for JavaScript. So if you're looking to learn JavaScript, maybe check that out. Then more props for your visualizations as well for learning them around React concepts.
Yeah, I read those as well by Dan Abramov, and I think the visuals were done by Maggie Appleton, which you should check because she has some fantastic designs. And yeah, like that's basically what he wanted to do. He explained all the basics of JavaScript with this kind of more mental model sort of thing. Like he wasn't explaining the syntax, he was just explaining the idea and the concepts behind objects and arrays and references and all the stuff. And I think that's fantastic. I don't know what he has with that, but it's really good.
Yeah, and I just dropped a link in the chat if you want to check that out. All right, well, at this point, is there any topics, anything that we haven't got to that we want to discuss that we missed? Anything we should end on?
I don't know. Yeah, I quite like this topic. So there's just so much to discuss. Yeah, I wish there was more of this type of kind of articles and resources out there, like more stuff that people could see, not just read and have to wrap your own head around in your own way. Like if you are, you don't even need to be a senior in order to do these things. Like once you understand something, once you feel comfortable with something, you probably already have a mental model about it, or you have a specific way of thinking about it that is simplified from all the syntax and all the specifics. So I would say, yeah, just kind of write about it, make a video, explain it in this way to someone that is asking for your help. And I think that will just help people enter the field and understand things better.
I did have one sort of question we hadn't got to yet. Since a lot of this show revolves around learning, what advice would you give to a recent university grad who wanted to get into the industry? Do you have any ideas or skills or areas they should look at or not look at? Or
that's a really good question, actually, and it's something that some people have asked me as well in the past. I would say, like, first, obviously, it depends which field you want to join, and assuming that is front-end development, because that's what we're talking about, I would say that you should, first of all, build something that you want. Like, that's like the most important thing. Just choose what you want to do, right? I want to do an awesome blog, or I want to do an app for, I don't know, exercising better, whatever. Just choose something you want to do, and then kind of start doing it, and choose a few tools that you need. So if you want to learn React, then just learn React. Keep it as minimal as possible, because I think the biggest mistake people do is trying to learn a lot of things at the same time. JavaScript, React, Redux, Node.js, whatever else. That is just too much. Like, we're not built for that stuff. Just learn React, and by learning React, you're gonna be forced to learn JavaScript, and you already have basically all the tools you need to build actually super complex applications just with React. You don't need anything else. You don't need router or state management, nothing. Just learn one thing, build something that you want to build, and that will kind of keep you entertained and enthusiastic about it. And then once you have that, create more stuff. And every time you create something, you will run into limitations, right? So once you run into a limitation and you feel comfortable to tackle something new, find a way to kind of handle that. And then you will end up learning all the other pieces of the puzzle. And I think the best advice I can give is just apply for jobs earlier. Like everyone that I know that is kind of getting into the industry makes the mistake of studying too much and not applying to jobs. Like you need to apply for jobs eventually. So just do it earlier than you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Best advice I can give.
We have we're almost out of time, but we had one more really good question come in, so I just want to put it up real quick. So when you were making your visualizations, were there any moments that the process of making these actually helped you in terms of just learning or clarifying your own mental models?
Yeah, that is. Let me share my screen again. Yeah, I mentioned earlier today that when I was doing the part for use effect, I actually realized that there was a part that I had wrong, and if I remember correctly, is when it runs. So I believe that the use effect runs before it mounts, something like that. Like I had one detail wrong that is kind of quite important. So I just had to read the documentation for use effect quite a few times, which just points out that the documentation is the absolute best resource you can find. Because like literally the people that build the thing wrote it. So I just read it, and then I realized that I had been using this thing not wrong, but with a slightly mistaken mental model for like since it came out basically. So so I learned that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was like I thought USFL runs before it mounts, when it in reality is that it always renders, always, not like no matter what, the component will always render, and then it will execute the code inside, which might cause another re-render. There was some caveat there that I didn't quite understand fully, and like just writing this, I realized that what I was explaining didn't quite make sense. So I was like, there is something kind of weird there that my knowledge is kind of letting me down on. So I just went and kind of checked multiple times, did some experiments, and then I realized, okay, yeah, that's wrong. So that was interesting.
The joys of focused study.
All right, guys, we're coming up on our time here. I know one thing we like to do to wrap up here is just any picks or plugs we might happen to have that we might want to pass along. So Dan, you want to tackle that first?
Hey, the Enterprise React newsletter. We don't sell your email, and our developers curate all the content. So it's by developers for developers.
Christian, anything to add? Any plugs on your end?
No? Dan's got it.
Dan's got it covered. And Obed, anything you want to plug, or I guess in general too, if people have other questions or want to follow you, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, I'm always on Twitter, so Obed Parla, and my articles are on my blog, obedparla.com. And yeah, if I write anything, it's gonna be there. So all my very detailed articles are gonna be there. I have some plans, so hopefully I'll get to them eventually. And yeah, the same. I never spam or try to sell you anything. I just kind of write these detailed articles, and that's about it. So if you want to subscribe, go for it.
Is it worth mentioning Thinkful?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're quite a good company. So if you want to, I don't work for them full time. I'm just kind of a mentor on them. So they're quite a successful bootcamp, and they have very varied bootcamps, mostly for web development. So if you're looking for one of those, what?
I think we got an echo. If you have the stream open, it might be echoing back through.
Yeah. Anyway, if you're looking for like a web development bootcamp or something like that, then those are they are quite good.
That's great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and then from my end, all I've got is, so next week on React Wednesdays, we're going to be taking a little bit of a break. We're doing release week here at Progress. So if you're curious, but I think we're still getting, I think I'll mute your mic because I think we'll get some feedback from somebody.
Next week on React Wednesdays.
Actually, I'm not sure anymore. I just muted everybody because I'm not sure where that audio is coming from. It's coming magically. I think this is the internet's way of saying that we need to wrap this up quickly. So Exactly. So if you're interested in learning more about Kendo React, it's a set of UI components that we make here at Progress. We're going to be having a release webinar to talk about the new things we're releasing. If you're curious about that, I dropped it in the link. We're going to be doing a broadcast. We're also using Twitch for some of this as well. So check it out. And with that, Obed, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a lot of fun. Appreciate it. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Christian. Like I said, until next time, telleric.com/React Wednesdays. Check us out. Upcoming episodes and such.
Check it out. And with that, Obed.